Imagine losing someone without them ever leaving the world. There are no funerals, no condolences, just silence. This is a blind date with a book. Today's blind date understands a kind of grief most people never even realize exists. What hurts more? Losing someone forever, or never knowing if they are really gone? This book challenges one belief almost everyone has about love. But it's a blind date with a book. Why humans naturally hold on. But what if holding on is actually keeping us trapped? Have you ever waited for an apology that never came? The book completely redefines what letting go actually means. Healing doesn't require permission. What if peace doesn't come from answers? Sometimes relationships never become what we hoped. Sit with silence. But strangely, that's where this book becomes hopeful. The book isn't really about loss. It's about surviving love without certainty. We spend so much of life believing strength means holding on. Maybe real strength is discovering who you are when you finally loosen your grip. Then end with one final thought. Some stories end with reconciliation. Others end with understanding. And sometimes, that is enough. Now let's start rolling now, but remember this is a blind date with a book, and this is not the of the book. Stay till the end to find out the title. There's a kind of silence most people misunderstand. It doesn't come from absence. It comes from someone still existing somewhere, just not in your life anymore. And that difference changes everything. Because when someone is gone completely, the story ends. But when someone is still alive and still gone from your life, the story never knows where to stop. Today's blind date begins in that space. Not with answers, not with resolution, but with something far more uncomfortable. Unfinished connection. And here's the strange part. Most people don't even have language for this kind of pain. They just call it family issues, or distance, or they don't call it anything at all. Because how do you describe losing someone who is technically still there? You keep living. They keep living. But somewhere in between, something stops happening. And no one knows what to do with that silence. You might think the hardest part is missing them. But it isn't. The hardest part is the waiting, the checking, the imagining, the small, invisible rituals no one sees. A phone picked up too often, a message rewritten and deleted, a hope that gets quieter but never fully disappears. And at first, the mind tries to fix it. That's what we do. We search for the moment it broke. We replay conversations. We rewrite endings in our head, as if understanding it perfectly might somehow reverse it. But that's the trap, because not everything breaks at a single moment. Some things fade slowly, quietly, without permission, and still the brain refuses to accept that. So it builds a story instead. If I explain better, if I try again, if I become different, then maybe things return. But there's a problem with that kind of hope. It doesn't just keep you connected. It keeps you stuck. And this is where today's blind date begins to shift something subtle. Not by giving answers, but by questioning the entire idea of control. Because what if the effort to fix it is actually part of what keeps the pain alive? That question lands differently depending on where you are in your life. For some people, it feels almost offensive. For others, it feels like relief they didn't know they were allowed to have. But either way, it changes the direction of the story. Because now, it's no longer about them. It becomes about you. And that's where most people resist. Because it feels unfair. If you didn't cause the distance, Why should you carry the weight of healing from it? But emotional reality doesn't always follow fairness. It follows attachment, identity, and the invisible ways we tie our sense of worth to being understood. So when understanding disappears, something deeper gets shaken. Not just the relationship, but the self. And you start asking questions you don't say out loud. Questions like, did I fail? Was I not enough? Why does this feel so permanent? And the more you ask, the heavier it becomes. Because there are no clean answers waiting on the other side. Only repetition. Only uncertainty. Only time. But here's where something unexpected begins to happen. When control finally stops working, the mind does something it rarely allows itself to do. It starts noticing what is still here. Your breath, your body, your mornings, your routines, the parts of life that didn't leave with the relationship. At first, it feels almost wrong. How can anything feel normal when something so important is missing? But slowly, a different kind of question begins to form. Not how do I get it back, but how do I live while it stays unresolved? And that question is where today's blind date starts to deepen. Because it doesn't rush toward healing. It sits inside the discomfort long enough for something else to emerge. And what emerges first is not peace. It's resistance. Because part of you still believes that letting go means betrayal. That moving forward means forgetting. That acceptance means giving up. But what if none of that is true? What if letting go isn't an ending, but a different way of holding on? Not tighter, not looser in a way that disappears, but softer, less forceful, more honest. And if that sounds abstract, it won't stay that way for long. Because the story is about to shift again. Not outward, inward. And that shift changes everything you thought this was about. Because the next question is not about them. It's about who you become when the relationship no longer defines your emotional center. This is a blind date with a book because once the focus shifts inward, something unexpected happens. The pain doesn't disappear, but it stops being the only thing in the room. And for the first time, there is space. Not peace, not resolution, just space. Space to notice what was always there. Your routines, your habits, the parts of you that existed before the loss became the center of everything. And slowly, a difficult realization begins to form. You are still here, even if something important is not. But that realization doesn't feel comforting at first. It feels unfamiliar. Like standing in a room you used to know, but everything is slightly rearranged. And this is where the mind resists again. Because if you are still here, then what exactly defines you now? For a long time, the answer was simple. The relationship, the role, the expectation, the identity of being connected. But when that disappears, you're left with something harder. Not emptiness, but possibility. And possibility is uncomfortable. Because it doesn't tell you who you are. It asks you to find out again. So you begin to notice small things. The way sunlight moves across your floor in the morning. The sound of water boiling. The rhythm of ordinary days continuing without permission. And it feels strange. Because life didn't stop when everything changed. It just kept going. And that's when a quieter truth appears. Maybe healing was never about going back. Maybe it was about learning how to stay here without collapsing under what didn't return. But even then, there is still grief. It doesn't vanish. It changes shape. It becomes less like a storm, and more like whether you learn to walk through. And some days it still hits hard. Out of nowhere, a memory, a date, a sound, a moment you didn't prepare for. And that matters, because this story is not about becoming unaffected. It's about becoming able to continue without needing everything to be resolved first. And slowly, something begins to shift again. Not in the situation, but in you. You stop negotiating with reality. Stop rewriting conversations that can't be changed. Stop waiting for clarity that may never arrive. And in that space, something quieter enters, not joy, not certainty, but dignity. The dignity of still being here, of still eating, still waking up, still existing inside a life that didn't pause for grief. And that's when you realize something important. You were never only defined by what you lost. You were also defined by what remained. Your capacity to feel, to reflect, to endure, to keep going without guarantees. And that is where today's blind date starts to reveal itself. Not as a solution, not as a resolution, but as a mirror. A mirror that doesn't ask you to fix anything, only to see what already changed inside you. Because the truth is, some books don't give answers. They give perspective. And perspective changes everything without changing the situation itself. So when people finish this blind date, they rarely say they learned something. They usually say something quieter, something more personal. Like, I didn't realize I was carrying this. Or, I thought I was alone in this. And that recognition is where the final shift begins. Because once something is named, it becomes easier to hold. Not lighter, but clearer. And now, we are close to the moment where the blind date is finally revealed. But not yet. Because before we get there, there is one last question. What if the goal was never to fix the story, but to survive it without losing yourself? And if that question stays with you, then this blind date has already done its work. Because the final message is not about them. It was never only about them. It is about what remains when certainty is gone. When answers don't arrive. When connection doesn't return. When life continues anyway. And somehow you continue with it. Still feeling. Still remembering. Still standing. And now, we finally step into what this blind date really is. A book about love that doesn't disappear when distance arrives. A book about grief without closure. A book about learning to live when nothing is fully resolved. But I won't tell you its name here. Because some stories are stronger when you meet them yourself. You can find it through the link in the description if you want to support the channel and explore it directly. But more importantly, I want to leave you with this. Not every ending is an ending. Some are just pauses we learn to live inside. And the strongest people you know are not the ones who never broke. They are the ones who learned how to remain even after something important didn't return. Still standing doesn't mean unchanged. It means continuing. And maybe that's enough. Good, then we'll finish this properly. There's a moment in almost every story like this when the need for answers finally gets quiet. Not because everything is resolved, but because something inside stops demanding resolution. And that's usually the first sign of change. Not peace, not clarity, just less resistance. Because for a long time, the mind believes healing looks like getting something back. An apology, a conversation, a return, a different ending. But life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. So instead, we are left with something more complicated. Continuing. And strangely, continuing is where most people discover something they didn't expect. Not closure, but capacity. The capacity to wake up and still participate in life, even when part of it feels unfinished, even when questions remain open, even when nothing external has changed. And over time, that begins to reshape something deeper. Not the memory, but the relationship to it. It becomes less sharp, less immediate, not smaller, just further away. Like a sound that used to be in the room, slowly becoming part of the distance outside it. And in that distance, something else starts to exist again. Your attention, your choices, your present, not replacing what was lost, but existing alongside it. And that is where today's blind date finally makes sense. Not as a solution, not as advice, but as a quiet companion to something most people never talk about. A kind of grief that doesn't end. A kind of love that doesn't fully disappear. A kind of life that continues anyway. And the book at the center of this isn't trying to fix any of that. It's simply naming it slowly, carefully, without judgment. It doesn't tell you to move on. It doesn't tell you to hold on forever either. It does something far more subtle. It gives language to the space in between. The space most people live in but rarely describe. And maybe that's why it stays with people. Not because it answers the question, but because it finally acknowledges it exists. Because once something is acknowledged, it stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling like a shared human experience. So if you've been watching this thinking, "I've felt something like this before," you probably have. Just in your own version. And that's the real reason today's blind date matters. Not because it tells a new story, but because it makes an old one easier to carry. And now we can finally name it. Today's blind date is a guided reflection book about something many people experience, but rarely talk about openly. The experience of loving someone, still caring about them deeply, and yet living with a distance that may never close. A book about ambiguous loss, about grief without closure, about learning to stay standing, even when life doesn't resolve itself neatly. If you want to explore it for yourself, you'll find it linked in the description. Not as a recommendation you have to follow, but as an invitation, a chance to sit with it in your own way. Because books like this don't really end when the video does. They continue later. In quiet moments, in unexpected memories, in thoughts you didn't plan to have. And before we go, there's just one thing worth remembering. Not every story in life gets a clean ending. Some don't return what was lost. Some don't answer what we needed to know. Some simply ask us to keep living anyway. And somehow we do. Still remembering, still feeling, still adjusting, still standing. And maybe that's what matters most. Not that everything made sense, but that you did not disappear inside what didn't. If this was your first blind date, I'm glad you stayed for it. If it wasn't, I'll see you in the next one. And until then, may you carry what you need to carry without letting it carry all of you. And maybe now you understand. This was about what happens when life doesn't give you closure. But because at some point you stop where it happened, and you start learning how to drive not perfectly, not easily, but quietly, day by day until the wait no longer, and that's what not fixing the past. Not changing, but learning how to remain yourself. Even when part, and now, the blind date ends here, but your reflection doesn't have. If you want to discover check the video description below. That's where it's at. But only go because some books don't just inform you, they are. And if this experience spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe to the Dark Mind Pro. Beck, we explore love, loss. Until next time, stay aware, stay reflective, and stay human.